Welcome to the AI Guild podcast. Today we're going to be talking with Alphonse and Tim, the creators of MarkMaker. MarkMaker is an experiment to apply artificial intelligence to the world of design. They use a genetic algorithm to allow the system to grow and improve. There are two systems at play. First, the actual session that you're in, and second, improving the model as a whole for all users. I'm going to show you an example of how this works. I've typed in ABC company and have started looking at some of the designs. Might like this design, for example, and click the heart. That's not only going to tell the system that I like this design for this session, but it's also going to be telling other users that this is a type of design aesthetic that might be in trend. I'll let Tim and Alphonse explain more about this in the actual interview. I also need to take a moment and say this wouldn't be possible without companies like Amazon. If you have experience with machine learning and you're looking for a new challenge, there are 158 job openings at Amazon right now. Be sure to check out the link in the description to check it out. Let's hop into the interview. I'd love to hear kind of how you guys would describe what the concept is in your own words.
Sure. Shall I start off, Tim, a little bit?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, so I'm getting my notes at the same time because we talked about it before. So let me talk a little bit about the background of how the project started. Tim and I were both working in New York at a big design firm, so at a graphic design firm, we like to go hiking in the weekends just to get out of town. And during this hike, we would talk a lot about design and many other things, right? And at one time, I remember we were kind of reflecting on our everyday design practice. And we noticed two things happening. The first one is that within design, lots of things are kind of preconceived. For example, logos. If you have logos for a wine bottle, they always look alike or they look similar or at least within the same realm. And if you look at soda logos, they look completely different, but they all look kind of similar too. This is for the obvious fact that if you walk around in a supermarket, you want to see if it's a soda or a wine bottle, and you don't want to confuse the wine bottle for a soda brand. So that's the first thing we notice. And the other thing we notice is in our daily design practice, we were following this quite specific process in our design jobs. And every studio has its own process. So it seems like in everyday reality where you have to come up with new ideas quickly and produce designs very quickly, these processes are needed to ensure quality, but also for marketing purposes, everything should look similar within the strategy of the business, and you want to ensure a certain amount of quality. So we noticed these two specific things about processes and outcomes that are kind of are defined before you start a new project. And in a way, we wondered, well, if these are defined, can we create algorithms that use these same definitions of processes or outcomes, or can we create these? And in a short, we wondered, can we replace a design agency for an algorithm, basically? Mm-hmm. Which is a big question, yeah, and impossible to answer.
Yeah, and we're still early in it, but it's ambitious, and I love that.
Yeah. It's proven to be too ambitious at this point. Because it is very difficult for many different reasons. But this is how the project started off, basically, as the idea of, can we create algorithms or at least tools that replaces the design studio or parts of the processes of a design studio.
And I was reading in the About page that you had talked about using a genetic algorithm to think about generating these things. And part of my mind wanders into this idea of like how much of it do you kind of try to set up rules and then have an algorithm kind of generate these algorithms within that rule set versus just completely feeding it an existing data set and letting it kind of adapt its own rules? Is that part of that decision when you think about choosing an algorithm like that?
I mean,
okay,
my sense, yeah,
sorry,
one of the sort of themes that we've talked about a lot is this tension between sort of pre-programming a lot of behaviors and allowing behaviors to emerge, essentially. And especially in the design world, right, you have trends that emerge over time, and they're pretty unpredictable. And so one of our goals was to design a system where trends could kind of emerge and track the sort of cultural change without us having to step in and intervene. And so the sort of structure of the system is that each logo is represented by quite a few parameters. And those parameters were chosen to sort of correspond to the way people and designers, but also just average people on the street, the parameters were chosen to correspond to how they think about logos and design.
Right.
And the idea of the genetic algorithm is that essentially the various probabilities of different parameter values represent trends, essentially. So in certain fields, like for example, the color blue is more popular, and that higher probability for the color blue corresponds to a trend in the design world. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Does that make it, so when you kind of approach the challenge, and again, I know you guys are in the early days of playing around with this, and I know that you guys have some other side projects as well, kind of as part of this, but do you think that kind of slowly grows into, thousands and thousands upon thousands of attributes that you're kind of trying to capture? Or is it even bigger than that, or does it even not even matter? Like, am I thinking about that in the wrong way? Does that make sense?
So is the question, like, in order to be able to design more kinds of logos, do we need to have more parameters?
Yeah, I think that might be a good way of asking my question. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's completely one possible approach. And
Yeah.
I think that the way that we've approached this sort of overall project of Emblematic is that there really is this emphasis on research, and sort of, I think that is a valid thing that we've devoted some time to, this idea that you can sort of represent the space of all possible logos as a bunch of parameter settings within a bunch of different templates, for example.
Okay.
But then I think that the other approach is to try to find a much more generic solution. So for example, using neural networks, instead of having to explicitly set hundreds of parameters, they sort of emerge on their own. And that's sort of the other track of research that we're thinking about.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. So you guys were hiking, you guys were talking. I mean, was this, I know that you have like 3 projects, I think, at least on the site. Was this the first one? Like, I'd love to kind of hear the, like, man, we should actually sit down and start doing this moment.
Oh, that moment has passed many times.
Yeah.
I think that moment started early 2016 or April or something like that, because I think the Mark Maker, if we're specifically talking about that, I think it was pushed online somewhere in the summer of 2015 or fall 2015. But we never gave much thought about doing anything with it until Tim dropped a line on a blog somewhere. Which one was it, Tim? Do you remember?
I think it might have been Designer News.
Yeah, something like that. You just drop one sentence like, "Hey, we made this, check it out," and then the whole thing blew up. And we had like 350,000 visitors in like 3 or 4 weeks.
That's awesome.
Like
Yeah, that's great.
So this is where the first things. Go ahead, Tim.
Sorry, I was going to say that this is sort of stepping back even further. I think that one of the things about this project is that it has emerged kind of out of a bunch of smaller experiments. Yeah. So, for example, this sort of like Alphonse and I going on hikes and chatting, and we have 2 very different kind of perspectives. Alphonse's background is more in design, and I studied computational linguistics, sort of became a designer later on. And so these conversations that we'd had sort of looking at the same issues from different perspectives,
right.
After we go on these hikes, maybe I'd hack something together and we'd look at it. And so rather than having one big moment of like, we have to do this, it's been much more sort of natural, like little experiments that succeed or fail, and allowing a bigger project to kind of emerge from that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, the side projects you're referring to are actually, for us, are platforms to test small ideas.
Right.
And basically, these side projects emerge first before we try to implement an idea into the MarkMaker. MarkMaker is kind of an accumulation of all those small ideas.
Interesting.
The first one we did was this country name generator, which was a pure linguistic fun toy. I remember it was like Friday night at like 9 p.m., something like that, after work, and Tim just quickly hacked it together. And from there, we created a flag generator because we thought, like, if we can do this with linguistics, can we exchange specific elements into visuals, and can we do a similar tactic to flags? And slowly, these smaller projects started to grow until we had been talking about doing a logo generator many times, but we never knew how to go about it until there was some point we thought, hey, now we know maybe how to do this.
Right.
And then we just tested that.
Yeah.
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 So it's really an accumulation of smaller ideas coming together to be able to create a bigger idea. Yeah.
And Timothy, do you feel like there has been kind of a lot of progression in kind of either open source models that have started to enable your ability to kind of quickly test these ideas? I mean, you kind of make it sound like, oh yeah, I just, I threw together this thing that was pretty complex but relatively easy. And I'm sure you're talented, but I'm also sure you're leveraging some open source stuff too along the way. So has there been progression that's enabled that faster?
Right. Yeah, and I think that that's completely revolutionizing this whole field. I mean, the idea of creative AI is really only a possibility because of the just really amazing contributions that are happening on the academic side and also sort of on the corporate side. So, absolutely, as our projects get more sophisticated, we leverage those tools more and more. But even in our earlier projects, we weren't using like pre-existing software packages, but we were certainly using techniques that were borrowed from other disciplines. Like, for example, this sort of country name generator is just a Markov chain tool. And like that's a trivial piece of software to write, but to actually figure out the theory and how something like that works is like an enormous amount of work. So we're standing on people's shoulders even when we're not using like pre-existing software packages, essentially.
Yeah, and that's a really great distinction that that I've been fascinating. Again, my role at the company I work for is around product management, and so I always talk to the engineers, and part of my angle is like, hey, I don't know how to do any of this stuff. I kind of trying to push this together and match our needs with our problems, and I need to have a basic understanding of it, but I often don't know the nuts and bolts of it. But the piece that's really interested me when I browse the creative AI, and I think that this is kind of what you're getting at, is I'll watch someone take a technique with, some sort of like neural net style transfer type concept, and they'll do it. I think there was an example I'm thinking of is I saw it come out with furniture objects, and they were passing like certain styles and furniture objects, and then someone else like a month later started doing that with faces and sunglasses and whether or not it had bangs or whatnot. And it was like, oh, it's like it's really interesting to take that strategy and just apply it to the next piece necessarily, and then kind of rewriting the entire wheel, which is seemingly getting a lot of progression.
Yeah, completely.
I can add something. Like the visual part is actually the same story. Like a lot of the parameter thinking for the MarkMaker grabs back to research from the Bauhaus from the 20s and 30s about how like visual elements and how they get together and how those work. So also on that part, we're stepping on the shoulders of other people, and that's becoming easier accessible as well too, because like especially through all the platforms that are rising about design, it's easily accessible to learn about these different ways of putting things together design-wise and creating visuals.
That's
so
a really
as well.
That's an interesting point, because I've learned so much from, I work closely with a designer on our team that's been my co-founder at 2 companies, and she's taught me so many different, like, I don't want to say hard and fast rules, but these just certain rules about kerneling and about serif and sans serif, and I was like, and is that kind of that piece that you're talking about of saying like, okay, there's actually these things that make something designed well, and then we're starting to better understand what that is. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, kind of. There are two sides to that, obviously. But what I'm getting at is that the research and the ideas about how to make design in a good way, or what works well, is a better accessible and better quantified, actually, or qualified. And using those techniques is much easier than, say, 10 years ago, when there were like 5 blogs on the internet about design.
Right.
So there's more content out there. It has a drawback as well, which we are very aware of, and that is that these things create, or these platforms tend to draw towards trends again, and everything becomes like a trendy thing instead of a profound research thing. So there's pros and cons to that, but that's an all other debate. But
I was talking with some coworkers the other day, and we were kind of laughing about. Well, I shouldn't say laughing, because it's kind of there's a layer of sadness, but it doesn't feel like as much. And I might be wrong. Maybe the internet has connected this so much, but I feel like there's less of like that crazy kind of like working in the workshop, just inventing their own future, and they're not running into anything. I picture the Renaissance and just obsessed inside some little studio somewhere, and like you're not getting bombarded with a tweet of some other person in another country that now might be doing that same thing, and now you're struck with this anxiety, or like, how do I build my thing better? You're just kind of in your workshop doing your thing and whatever. And
exactly. I mean, I definitely feel that sort of like, somebody else getting their first anxiety, but on a certain level, like that seems like okay price to pay for also being exposed to such like a rich world of research.
Yeah.
Like, I think especially in the design world, there hasn't been an enormous amount of real quantitative aesthetic research.
Yeah.
And to be able to sort of access that increasing body of work sort of as it happens has also been a big impact on the work that we've been able to do.
Yeah, no, that's
and from a historic perspective, I mean, in the 50s and the 60s, all the designers knew each other as well, and they were all looking at each other. But it was more locally organized. So maybe there was a group in Holland and a group in the US. Well, they happened to know each other, but maybe they didn't know the designers from Africa or something, So it's not a new phenomenon. It's just becoming more global.
Yeah, good, healthy perspectives. So, what is something that if someone was listening that might be helpful? Go to the site, use it, feedback, support a new project. What could be helpful if someone was watching this?
Tim, you go ahead.
Do you want to take that, Alphonse? Oh yeah, I mean, I would say. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that's a very difficult question to answer. In a way that we're just researching this. So actually, obviously, apart from the other things like new technologies, business ideas, all those things, which can become important, I think feedback is the most important input for us. Whether it's positive or even negative, that's okay. Because we're trying to really ground this in a realm of more people and a broader audience, from the design and the tech world, but even further than that. So any kind of feedback would be very welcome to help us out. We've had lots of feedback about details, but also bigger feedback, like from a holistic perspective, would be very interesting to encounter and to see.
I would also say that, you mentioned it could be helpful for people to just go and use the site. And I think that's absolutely the case. Like the site on a certain level is kind of alive, right? Like the way that it learns about trends is by people using the site and saying what they like and don't like. Right. And so to the extent that people don't use it, it's actually not a very useful tool. And so if people just go and use it and click around and express what their preferences are and what they like and don't like, it'll actually help the tool be a better tool.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so actually a question on that. So when you are giving feedback, and so I'm not going to share my screen on this, and so I'll encourage people to kind of check it out, but you kind of input the name of the thing, starts generating some logos, you start clicking the heart button on the ones you like. Are the heart buttons, is that giving positive feedback to kind of my design aesthetic, or is that kind of just giving a global input into saying like, hey, these are things I like, and so just do more good stuff.
So on your, like in your session with the tool, those heart icons are guiding the way the tool generates logos for you.
Okay, cool.
And so like, for example, you can do an experiment. You can go through and only click heart icons on green logos. And soon enough, you will only have green logos with some room for variation, essentially. But at the same time, it's keeping track of all the hearts that everybody clicks anywhere. So when you begin a session, you're not beginning from a random group of parameters. You're beginning from a set of, like a gene pool, essentially, of logos that other people have liked recently.
Yeah.
Does that kind of make sense? So
yeah.
Hey, go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, thinking of like a programmer at a startup kind of audience, like, how are you storing that in a seat, like a relational database? Is it like how are you actually storing the hearts, like on a basic database?
Yeah, this is all just stored in Firebase.
Okay, cool. And so you generate, and like, are you generating like an ID that has different little attributes that tell you what that logo is on kind of your file system, and then
the app is an entirely single page app. It runs entirely on the client. And so it generates these long parameter strings, or these long parameter, they're big JSON objects. And then every time you like a logo, it sends that set of parameters up to Firebase. But at the same time, it puts that set of parameters into the gene pool for the next generation of logos that you see.
Got it. Interesting. That's really cool. And then
so we're passing around these big JSON objects, essentially.
Right. And then so every time you're passing that to the gene pool, and then let's say you scroll and the bottom of the site's kind of spinning, that part is saying, okay, like, go access the gene pool. It's now updated, and go do XYZ.
Right. So every time it generates a new logo. It generates a logo by going into the gene pool and saying, there's a certain number of parents that any logo can have. Sort of intuitively, you can think of a logo as having 2 parents, but actually some genetic algorithm research has indicated that having more parents potentially gives you better results faster. But even if you just think about 2 parents, when it generates a new logo, it says, okay, I'm going to take the color from logo A. I'm going to get the color from my mom. I'm going to take the font from logo B, right? I'm going to get my font from my dad. And so it mixes the attributes of other logos that are in the gene pool to generate new logos. And then there's also sort of a random mutation factor so that you don't get stuck in a rut, essentially.
Right. Cool. Yeah, that's fascinating. I appreciate you kind of taking us one layer deeper into kind of the engineering side. That's really great.
For sure.
Is there anything that, like, so obviously, I think there's some very obvious practical applications of the kind of the concepts that you guys are working on. You talked about kind of this ability to, like, a design studio that's automated in certain ways. Are there other applications that you guys have either run into or have thought of like, like, I hadn't thought of that, but that might be a really interesting area to apply? I mean, the random flag generator is a great example of that, but you guys are obviously thinking creatively about it. But are there other kind of unusual applications?
Do you want to take that, Alphonse?
Yeah. Short answers, we don't know. Our research is kind of nerdy fundamental on a way of just answering the question, how can we generate graphic design in a way, and finding out new applications or real life applications is hard. We can come up with many different kinds of projects to do within this realm that are interesting, but actually finding a real application that is accessible for a broader audience is really difficult at this moment, or we haven't figured it out. We can obviously, for MarkMaker, we can make it like a logo generator tool that people can use and create a business model around that. Or you can think about it in a way of a design studio where what the tool is doing is basically the work of interns. Just create a bunch of logos for us and we'll pick one. Maybe this is a way it becomes a tool for designers to help them design things. Yeah. So the role of the designer becomes more of a curator than an actual maker. We can see things happening in that realm. So the close foreseeable future is not very clear with this. other than making the project better, finding better business models around it, those kind of things. But a clear idea of what kind of application this can run into for a broad audience, it's not really there at this point. Right, Tim? Yeah.
No. Oh, go ahead, Ted.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on the intern part of it. I thought that was a really interesting comment because I don't know exactly what your guys' design studio does, but at the company, at our company, I feel like kind of these relatively intern level, like, okay, generate some Facebook ads, and we need 10 of them, and the marketing team disagrees on all of them, and they're all the smallest detail difference. The copy might change a little bit, might flip it left a line, right a line, and it's like it feels like there's these projects that are just like, okay, we just literally need to generate 50 of these and look at them and just pick 10, and that's what we're rolling with. Feels super applicable to kind of that concept that you guys are working on.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've thought about a lot is how sort of the development of design tools has really changed the sort of role of the designer, right? Like there was a time when, you would be like, the designer was a guy like, like setting type in like setting movable type. And obviously there's been enormous change brought about by desktop publishing and all of that, where kind of people who normally would have been sort of specifying type, now they're able to actually really like lay it out using a tool like InDesign. But tools like MarkMaker and a bunch of other of these sort of augmented reality or artificial intelligence assisted design tools start to shift the role of the designer from kind of a maker to more of a curator. And we think that that's going to have just like big cultural impact, not just in the field of design, but sort of more broadly, where, when you need a logo, you don't need to go to a designer to design it for you. You can sort of become the curator and the art director on your own without really having to know how to use InDesign or Photoshop or whatever.
Right.
But obviously, like, this tool is not that, right? This tool is like the training wheels version of that. And it's interesting to see the kind of impact that it might have. But like that transition is obviously in the future.
I think you guys are touching on a theme that comes up a lot, and it's coming up right now, like post-American election, trying to figure out, you'll hear a lot of people in the industry, and I think of this too, you hear, obviously, like, without diving too deep into politics, you have this anti, like, the globalization is taking away jobs. And I think that me being in the tech industry, I'm far more like, you guys have no idea, it's the technology that will disrupt the jobs. And then we're thinking about jobs in an entirely different way. And it's, automated trucks and autonomous vehicles and all these different things. Those are going to be the real challenges for job displacement. And we need to rethink part of that. You guys touched on this idea, though, of like an assistant. Do you guys see a lot of this kind of artificial intelligence coming out as really collaborative tools for existing jobs, and maybe displacement of intern level, and maybe that's just a short-term thing, but how do you guys think about kind of the long-term collaboration / replacement impact on design or any other fields that are in the space?
I mean, I'd be interested to hear what you think, Alphonse, but like my first pass at that is that I think that we want to build tools that are like about empowering people, right? We don't want to like disempower designers or just, sort of more average sort of non-designers on the street, right? Like, we want to create tools that allow you to do more and make more. And I don't think that this set of tools is actually gonna like make people lose their jobs. Like, I think that they're going to potentially change people's jobs, but they're going to change them in a direction that's kind of more interesting. Like, the sort of entry-level job, the entry-level job is going to be the equivalent of a much higher job, like a much more advanced job in the current sort of design ecosystem.
Yeah, like my thinking about that is as follows. If you look at all the lists, right, of jobs that are going to be replaced by artificial intelligence, the creative jobs are always somewhere at the bottom of the list, because there's this idea of creativity being this kind of holistic thing that cannot be done by algorithms.
Right.
And I think MarkMaker has had some attention, and we've had lots of questions about this, because this was kind of the first, like Tim said, training wheel version of an idea that it might be possible to replace a designer by artificial intelligence. Our point of view is that maybe the actual creation of the symbol or the object or the design is not the most creative activity you can have, because of all the reasons that it has to fit within specific rules within society.
Right.
There's always a place for design that has to be creative and open and out there, and that will never be generated by AI, obviously. But if we go back to symbols or design that has to fit within a current culture, you can maybe claim that that's not the most creative or intellectual part of the design job, but actually being able to choose what works within the culture and what doesn't, and what does work and what does. And I think this is what Tim refers to as being the curator, the designer becoming more the curator. The actual knowledge of how to place a specific thing within the culture is something that is, I don't see that being replaced by AI yet. Maybe if we model the whole world, then we can do it. But so I think the job of the designer might shift in that way to the curator and becoming more of a different job. And maybe that's also a thing in other fields, which I don't know enough about to have specific ideas about. But in the design field, definitely, I think that could be the case. That the knowledge of culture is more important.
That's a super interesting. I hadn't really fully thought about it in that way of the creativity is just changing. Like what you're being creative about is changing when you implement these different types of tools. And I think we see that all over the place. I mean, you talked about empowering people and something that, you know, obviously it's training wheels version of what you're kind of building, but I do think kind of moving forward, I think the idea of having this ability to enable a small business owner who owns a local deli or whatever the small business is to be able to quickly and affordably be able to create assets like that for his marketing or whatever it is, enables him to go do the thing he's actually really great at, which might be making sandwiches or whatever it is. And so you've empowered this person to create a professional thing and focus, double down on what they're actually great at. And I suspect that there's some designers that would potentially, let's just say that it does get to some level of displacement, that actually may force people to be creative in a better way that they might even have a better outlet in, which hopefully would increase the net overall output for humanity. So it's an interesting perspective.
Hopefully, yes.
Hopefully, yeah. And not, I don't know. Yeah.
and now you're talking about empowering a local business owner, right? But like global businesses will not quickly resort to these kind of applications. Like, I don't know, big fashion brands or car brands will always go to big design firms to help them out with the specific problems. Right. So that's not going to change anytime soon, probably. But
I would suspect a counterculture as well, right? If there was a lot of AI, I was thinking about this. I was listening to an AI jazz performance, and they sold tickets on this idea that it was all generated by AI to do a jazz concert. And I think I was talking to one of my coworkers, and we were like, man, what if that's all the music? And I was like, well, what's going to happen is there's going to be a counter revolution, right? And it's going to be like, okay, there was no AI involved in editing, composing. This is all human generated. And you're going to have a club that's specifically pushing the human music, which I think would probably start to happen. You'd be like, okay, this is a fashion brand and we only use humans because X, Y, Z. Maybe.
Yeah, in design, there's a precedent in book design, for example, where book design was a commodity like 20 years ago. Everybody made books because that was the platform to publish your information in. Obviously, this went to digital printers and to the web. And nowadays, the book, for a lot of designers, means this special object that is made through craft with special printing techniques, those kind of things. Yeah. So this is shaping a precedent in that kind of way, and this counterculture. But I mean, the training wheel version is not even there, is there now, but counterculture, people are more, like at this point in time, people are more worried about this taking their job than thinking about counterculture against this.
Yes.
It's like 10 steps ahead. Yeah.
Yeah.
At least that's the question we get.
Yeah, that.
Say again?
Anything to add to that? Sorry, I hit a little rant and I wanted to make sure.
No, I think that makes sense. Although I think, like Alphonse said, essentially, like at this point, this is the counterculture.
Right.
Yeah.
Makes
definitely.
Cool. Yeah. If you guys, 30 seconds, or it doesn't have to be 30 seconds exactly, but in anything that you feel like soapbox, meaning anything you want to say, tell, rant, 30 seconds.
I mean, it may take a few more than 30 seconds.
Go for it.
But it actually feels like a theme that we've sort of touched on a couple of times in this conversation, is this idea of being a generalist. And I was telling Alphonse that I was recently reading the Charles Darwin Voyage of the Beagle. It's like his notes from his journeys around South America. And there's a scene in it where he's traveling across the landscape and he notices that like the vegetation changes from just one kind of vegetation to another kind of vegetation. And he immediately speculates that what that means is that the geological formations underground are changing from one kind of rocks to another kind of rocks. Yeah. And like that ability to take knowledge and sort of inquisitiveness from one area of expertise and apply it to something that's fairly different, I think is like super valuable. And it allows you to sort of see connections and sort of like create a world that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And so I feel like that kind of applies to this, this type of work also, where it's like Alphonse is a designer and I have more of a linguistics background, and we are able to sort of like bring those two fairly different fields together to create sort of unexpected new things. And I feel like that's like a really important thing to sort of value right now, especially in a culture where we really incentivize specialization, right? Like being able to, being like an expert in programming or an expert in design or an expert in architecture or whatever is really valued professionally and also educationally. And I think that we just need to make sure that we leave room for people who are pretty good at a lot of things, because they can just bring insight that you're not going to be able to get if you're sort of super deep in your own silo.
It's cool. Alphonse?
Well, we talked about making the same statement, but I would say save the spider monkey in the Amazons.
Yeah, I love it, man. I love it. Cool.
Yeah.
Great.
Anything else that you guys want to chat on? Other than that, I mean, I really appreciate you guys taking the time to hop on and talk about this. I think it's super interesting. I think anyone who is using MarkMaker and knowing this, hey, this is the training wheels. I think even to me, just seeing exploration in the idea is awesome. And we talked about book covers, and my mind started wandering of like, okay, is that kind of the next, is that a thing that could be applied to? And I'm sure the list goes on and on. Album covers and even future music video generators, right? Like, but really interesting stuff. Anything else you guys wanted to chat about?
I don't think so. This was great, though.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and also thank you for inviting us, coming from such a nerdy designy perspective as well. I think that's quite cool that even with this kind of get together, we can talk about these different fields. I think that's great.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah,
all right, I'm going to stop the broadcast. Thanks for watching.
Thanks so much.